The wind howled like a living thing, screaming through the endless white wasteland. Snowflakes, sharp as tiny knives, slashed across Captain Daniel Rain's face as he stumbled forward. His thermal suit struggled to keep him warm, its power reserves dropping with every passing hour. The storm had grown worse. If he didn't find something soon, he wouldn't last the night. His ship had crashed 2 weeks ago on this frozen world. The distress beacon was weak, barely strong enough to send a signal. He had shelter, a small emergency pod half buried in the snow, but food and heat were running low. If no one came soon, he would freeze to death. Still, Daniel refused to give up. He had survived worse. Tonight he was searching for anything useful. Fuel, wreckage, something to burn, but all he found was ice, snow, and silence. The sky was a deep starless black, and the cold was so deep it made his bones ache. Then he saw it, a shape in the snow. At first he thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow, a piece of wreckage, maybe even a frozen animal. But as he moved closer, his heart pounded harder. It was a body. Daniel rushed forward, falling to his knees in the snow. It was small, curled up like a child, covered in frost. The body was humanoid but strange. The skin, where it wasn't covered in ice, shimmered faintly under his suit's flashlight. It wasn't human, an alien. Daniel hesitated. He had seen many alien species before, but never one like this. The creature's features were delicate, almost fragile, with long, slender limbs and faintly glowing veins beneath pale, bluish skin. Her face, because yes, it was a she, was peaceful, as if she were only sleeping, but her lips were blue and her body was completely still. She's freezing to death. His training kicked in. He wasn't sure if her species needed warmth the same way humans did, but there was no time to question it. Carefully, he scooped her up. She was cold, too cold. Her body was light in his arms, like she weighed almost nothing. Daniel turned and began the long, slow walk back to his shelter. The emergency pod was small but sturdy, buried under a thick layer of ice to block the worst of the wind. Inside, a small heater flickered, barely enough to keep the space livable. Daniel laid the alien girl on the floor, quickly grabbing his only thermal blanket. He wrapped it around her carefully, then checked for signs of life. She was still breathing, barely. Her skin was icy to the touch. He had no idea if she could survive this cold much longer. "Come on, stay with me," Daniel muttered, rubbing her arms, trying to warm her up. Her body trembled slightly, a good sign. He reached for a ration pack, tearing it open and holding a small water pouch to her lips. "Hey," he said softly, "can you hear me?" No response. Her eyes stayed shut. He sighed, leaning back. He didn't even know if she could drink water. Hell, he didn't even know what she was, but he couldn't just let her die. The heater flickered weakly, and Daniel cursed under his breath. The power cells were running low. He had maybe a few more days before the heater died completely. After that, he'd be in the same state as her, frozen, lifeless, buried in snow. He shook the thought away and focused on the present. Time passed. The storm outside raged on, but inside the pod was quiet. The only sounds were Daniel's breathing and the faint hum of the heater. Then movement. Daniel turned sharply. The alien girl's fingers twitched. Her body shuddered under the blanket. Then with slow, painful effort, her eyes fluttered open. They glowed a soft, faint blue light like starlight trapped beneath her skin. Her gaze locked onto him, confused, unfocused. Daniel let out a breath of relief. "Hey, you're alive, that's good." Her lips parted, but no words came out. She was still weak. Daniel reached for another water pouch and held it out to her. "Can you drink?" She didn't take it. Instead, her hand reached out, grabbing his wrist. Her fingers were like ice. Daniel froze. She held on to him tightly, her glowing eyes full of something he couldn't understand. Was it fear, desperation? She tried to speak again. This time a sound came, a whisper, soft and broken. Warmth." Daniel frowned. "Yeah, I know you're freezing." He tried to pull his arm away, but she held on. Her grip tightened, too tight. Something wasn't right. Daniel's skin tingled where she touched him. A strange sensation spread through his body, like heat draining from his veins. His breath caught in his throat. His own body temperature was dropping. Daniel yanked his arm back. The girl gasped, her body shaking violently. She looked at him with wide, desperate eyes. "And need warmth," she whispered again. Daniel stared at her. She wasn't just cold. She needed warmth. She needed him. The storm outside howled louder. Inside the tiny pod, Daniel Raines realized he might have just saved something far more dangerous than a frozen stranger. The hunger beneath the skin. The fire crackled softly in the small emergency pod, casting flickering shadows across the frozen walls. The alien girl lay wrapped in the thermal blanket, her trembling body pressed as close to the heat source as possible. Daniel Raines watched her carefully, still rubbing feeling back into his own arm where she had grabbed him. His skin was clammy, his fingers numb from the strange, unnatural cold that had seeped into him the moment she touched him. Something wasn't right. He had expected her to be weak, sluggish, maybe even unresponsive. Instead, she was staring at him now, unblinking, her glowing eyes reflecting the firelight like twin stars trapped beneath ice. And then she spoke. "You, warm." The voice was barely above a whisper, rough and uneven, as if the words themselves were foreign to her tongue. Still, she spoke English. His grip tightened around the emergency ration in his hand. "Yeah," he said cautiously, "you were dying out there." The alien girl didn't respond. Instead, she shifted under the blanket, pushing herself upright with slow, delicate movements. The way she moved sent a shiver down Daniel's spine, not because she was unsteady, but because she was too smooth, like liquid sliding into place. She kept staring at him. Her gaze wasn't one of gratitude, it was hunger. Daniel swallowed, forcing himself to push past the growing unease in his chest. He had seen desperate survivors before, humans lost in space, clinging to their last breath, their last shred of hope. But this was different. He held out the water pouch. "Here, you need to drink." She didn't take it. Instead, she lifted a hand and pointed at him. Daniel frowned. "What?" The girl exhaled, and for the first time he noticed how small and fragile she looked, how thin. Her veins pulsed beneath her pale skin, glowing softly. She shivered, but not from the cold. "Need warmth," she whispered again. Daniel's stomach twisted. He knew deep down that she didn't mean heat, she meant him. The fire crackled again, but Daniel barely heard it. His instinct screamed at him. This wasn't just a lost, helpless alien. This was something else, something dangerous. Outside, the storm raged on, thick walls of snow trapping them inside the pod together. And for the first time since crashing onto this frozen planet, Daniel wondered if freezing to death might not have been the worst thing that could happen to him, because now he wasn't sure if he was trapped in here with her, or if she was trapped in here with him. The nature of her hunger. Daniel woke up gasping, his breath a cloud of mist in the freezing air. Something was wrong. His body felt sluggish, heavy, like the heat had been drained from his muscles. His fingers ached with cold, his skin clammy despite the fire still crackling in the pod. A deep chill settled in his bones, not the kind caused by the weather outside, but something far worse. Then he felt it, a weight pressed against his side. He turned his head, heart pounding. The alien girl was curled against him, her body half covered by the thermal blanket. Her arms were wrapped around his torso, her face buried in his shoulder. He barely recognized the fragile, near-frozen creature he had rescued the night before. Her skin wasn't as pale now. Her veins pulsed with light, a soft blue glow racing through them like embers coming back to life. She looked stronger. And Daniel felt drained. His breath caught in his throat. He jerked his arm, trying to pull away. She didn't move. He struggled harder, and this time she lifted her head, blinking slowly, dazed, unfocused. Then she tightened her grip. Daniel's body tensed. A strange, tingling sensation spread from where her fingers pressed against his side, an unnatural cold seeping into his skin like frost spreading over glass. She wasn't just warming up. She was taking warmth, his warmth. Daniel gritted his teeth. "Let go." She hesitated for a moment. Her glowing eyes flickered with something that almost looked like guilt. Then, slowly, her fingers uncurled, and the cold creeping into his bones began to fade. Daniel shoved himself backward, breath ragged, pressing his palm against his chest. His heart was racing. His body felt wrong, like something vital had been siphoned from him in the middle of the night. He stared at her, his voice sharp. "What the hell did you do to me?" The girl flinched. She pulled the blanket closer around herself, as if trying to make herself smaller. Her lips parted, but when she spoke, her voice was raw, weak. "Didn't mean to." Daniel swallowed hard. His instinct screamed at him to get as far away from her as possible, but there was nowhere to go. They were trapped together in this frozen wasteland, and whether he liked it or not, she needed him. Or more accurately, she needed his heat, his life. And for the first time, Daniel wasn't sure if she could stop herself from taking more. The Predator's Dilemma. Daniel sat against the cold metal wall of the pod, his pulse still uneven, his breath slow and controlled. He wasn't sure if the trembling in his hands was from the freezing air or from her. The alien girl sat across from him, wrapped in the thermal blanket like a ghost hiding in the fabric. She hadn't spoken in the last hour. She just watched him, her glowing veins pulsing softly like a heartbeat. He could see Daniel's body still felt weak, not dangerously so, but enough to notice, enough to fear. She had drained something from him. Not blood, not energy in the way a human would understand it. Something deeper, something primal, heat, vitality, and she had done it in her sleep. What happens if she loses control again? Daniel's fingers tightened around the emergency knife strapped to his boot. He wasn't sure if it would do anything to her, but if she tried to latch onto him again, he needed to be ready. Finally, the silence broke. "Not hurt you?" Her voice was quiet, careful, but Daniel wasn't convinced. "You already did." His words were blunt, edged with something close to anger. "You nearly drained me dry in my sleep. What happens if you do it again? What happens if you can't stop?" She winced, her glowing eyes flickering like a dying ember in the dark. I need warmth." Daniel scoffed. "Yeah, I got that much." She hesitated, her fingers curled against the blanket. "Did not want to take, just my body," she exhaled slowly, struggling to explain. "Instinct." Daniel narrowed his eyes. Instinct to do what? The alien girl swallowed. Then, after a moment of silence, she whispered, "To survive." The air in the pod felt heavier. Daniel ran a hand down his face, his mind racing. This wasn't just about comfort for her. It wasn't a preference. It was life or death. She hadn't meant to drain him, but if she got desperate enough, would she even have a choice? His gaze flicked back to her. She wasn't just sitting idly, she was shivering. Even now, bundled in the blanket, her body wasn't warm enough. She was starving. And the only food source left on this planet was him. A deal with the ice devil. Daniel stared at the weak flame in the heater, the only thing keeping this frozen world from swallowing them both. It was dying just like her. Across from him, the alien girl sat curled in the thermal blanket, her glowing veins flickering like a failing signal. She was shivering harder now, her limbs shaking as if they barely obeyed her anymore. She was running out of time, and so was he. Daniel clenched his jaw. His body still felt off, like a part of him had been siphoned away, drained by her touch. He wasn't dying, not yet, but he knew if she took too much, if she lost control again, there might not be anything left of him to wake up next time. And yet she was looking at him with desperate eyes, hollow with hunger, and somehow he couldn't just watch her fade away. The storm outside raged on. No rescue, no backup plan, just the two of them trapped in the cold, waiting for the inevitable. Daniel let out a slow breath and made a choice. "All right," he said, voice firm. "We do this my way." The alien girl blinked. "Do what?" "You need heat to survive," he pointed at himself. "I've got heat, but we have to control it. You don't get to take it whenever your body decides. You wait, you ask." Her glowing eyes widened. "If you lose control, if you drain too much." Daniel's fingers tightened around his knife, his voice low, steady. "I'll stop you." A heavy silence filled the pod. Then, after a long, fragile moment, she gave a single, slow nod. Daniel exhaled. "All right, then." He pulled off one of his gloves and extended his hand. The girl hesitated, staring at it like it was a lifeline, one she was afraid to grab. Then carefully she reached out, her cold fingers brushing against his palm. The moment their skin touched, a strange sensation spread through him, a slow pull like warmth bleeding from his body into hers. But this time it wasn't violent, it wasn't desperate, it was controlled. Her body stilled, her trembling slowing. She let out a soft, shuddering breath, relief flooding her features. Daniel felt the cold creeping into him, but he gritted his teeth and held firm. This was the deal. One human, one starving alien, a fragile balance between survival and something far worse. For now, they had a truce. But Daniel knew one thing for certain. If this didn't work, if she ever lost control again, there wouldn't be a second deal. The inevitable betrayal. Daniel woke up with a sharp gasp, his breath misting in the cold air. Something was wrong. The fire had dimmed to dying embers. The heater's weak hum had faded to an irregular, sputtering buzz, but that wasn't what sent a chill down his spine. It was her. She was too close. The alien girl was hovering over him, her hands barely an inch from his chest. Her glowing eyes locked onto him with something hungry, something she was trying and failing to suppress. Daniel's instincts roared to life. Before she could react, he grabbed his knife and had it pressed against her wrist. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" She jerked back instantly, her entire body trembling, but not from the cold, from need. I, her voice was raw, pained. I can't, I'm trying, but it's not enough." Daniel forced himself upright, never lowering the knife. His body felt weaker than before, not enough to collapse, but enough to know she had been taking again without permission. She had broken their deal. "Damn it," Daniel hissed, shaking his head. "I told you to wait to ask." She wrapped her arms around herself, curling in on her own body as if trying to fight off a deep ache. "You don't understand," she whispered, voice shaking. "It's getting worse, the cold. It's deeper now. I can't control it." Daniel's jaw clenched, his gut twisted. She wasn't lying, he could see it. Her veins, which once pulsed softly with blue light, now flickered erratically like a signal breaking apart. She was starving. She was losing control. But that didn't change the fact that she had already crossed a line, and it would happen again. Before he could say anything, a sudden sharp sound cut through the tension, a beacon alarm. Daniel's head snapped toward the blinking light on his emergency scanner. His heart pounded. A ship, someone was here. He surged to his feet, scanning the readout. It wasn't just random interference. This was an approaching vessel in the upper atmosphere. They were close. He turned back to the alien girl, but instead of relief, her face was stricken with terror, pure, paralyzing fear. "No," she whispered, shaking her head violently. "No, no, no." Daniel frowned. "What are you?" "They're not here for you," she rasped. "They're here for me." And then Daniel realized she wasn't afraid of freezing. She was afraid of being found. The emergency beacon's alarm pulsed like a heartbeat, filling the tiny pod with its rhythmic, mechanical ping. Daniel should have felt relief. He should have been grateful that after weeks of surviving in this frozen hell, someone was finally here to pull him out. But instead, he was staring at her. The alien girl, Salith, as she had called herself, was backed against the wall, her glowing veins flickering erratically, her breathing ragged. She looked less like a starving creature now and more like a trapped animal, terrified. Daniel took a step toward her, but she flinched. "Who's coming?" he demanded. "Why are you so scared?" She didn't answer right away. Her fingers dug into the thermal blanket like she was trying to keep herself from shaking apart. Then finally she whispered, "Your people." Daniel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. The pod scanner beeped again, pulling his attention to the readout. The ship was descending fast, too fast, not a slow, careful approach, a direct drop, a hunting pattern. Daniel's grip tightened around his knife. "No," he muttered. "That doesn't make sense. They're here because of my distress signal, not." And then he saw it, the ship's energy signature. Not a civilian rescue team, not a standard patrol, a Harvester-class vessel. Daniel's blood ran cold. He had seen those ships before, not on Earth, but in the fringes of human space, in places where people disappeared. They weren't here to save anyone. They were here to collect. His eyes snapped back to South. "What did they do to your people?" She swallowed hard. "We were taken," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "Our bodies, we generate heat energy, your kind." She faltered, looking away. "They found a way to extract it, to turn us into a power source." Daniel's stomach twisted. He wanted to deny it, wanted to tell her she was wrong. The humans didn't do things like that, but deep down he knew the truth. Humanity had conquered the stars not just by being strong, but by being ruthless, and Salith's kind. They were too valuable to be left alone. Daniel took a slow breath, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. Then he turned back to the control panel and shut off the beacon. The alarm died instantly. Salith's eyes widened. "What are you?" "They won't find us," Daniel said firmly. "Not if they think I'm already dead." He yanked out the power relay, making sure there was no way the signal could be restarted remotely. Outside, the ship was still descending, but without the beacon, it would have no direct landing coordinates. They would search, maybe for hours, maybe even days, but in a storm this bad, they would eventually give up. Esath just stared at him, her expression unreadable. Finally, she whispered, "You didn't have to do that." Daniel exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "Yeah, I did." A long silence stretched between them. Outside, the storm howled, covering their tracks in endless white. Esath slowly uncurled from the blanket, still weak but steadier now. "We should leave," she said softly. Daniel gave a tired smirk. "You got a ship hidden somewhere." "No," her glowing eyes met his. "But if we work together, we'll find one." Daniel glanced once more at the dark screen where his distress signal had been. No way home. No backup plan. Just him, an alien girl who needed him to survive, and the endless frozen wasteland beyond. He sighed. "Well," he muttered, pulling on his gloves, "let's get moving." And together they stepped out into the storm, into the white unknown. Into the white unknown. The wind howled as Daniel and Esath stepped beyond the safety of the pod into the frozen wasteland. The snow stretched endlessly in every direction, a white void swallowing the horizon. The sky, thick with storm clouds, offered no guidance. Daniel pulled his thermal coat tighter, checking his suit's power levels. Not great. It was running low, just like everything else. Esath, wrapped in the thermal blanket, moved carefully beside him. She was still weak, but her body pulsed faintly with warmth now. Her hunger had been subdued, but Daniel wasn't foolish enough to think it was gone. She needed warmth, he needed a way off this planet, and both of them needed to move. "Where are we going?" Esath asked, her voice small against the roaring wind. Daniel scanned the horizon. "There's wreckage from my ship a few kilometers west. Might be something there we can use, supplies, a working comms panel, maybe even a power cell for the heater." Salith hesitated. "And if there isn't?" Daniel inhaled, his breath turning to mist. "Then we find another way." They walked in silence, their boots crunching through the deep snow. Every step was a battle against the cold, against exhaustion, against the unshakable feeling that they weren't alone. Daniel couldn't stop glancing at the sky, searching for any sign of the Harvester-class ship. Had it truly left, or was it still circling, waiting for them to make a mistake? After an hour of walking, the wreckage came into view, twisted metal jutting from the ice like the ribs of a long-dead beast. Daniel let out a sharp breath. "There it is." Esath staggered slightly. He caught her by the arm before she could fall. "You okay?" She nodded, but her body trembled under his grip. The hunger was creeping back. Daniel didn't let go right away. She was dangerous, but she was also dying. He had made his choice. "We keep moving," he said firmly, guiding her toward the ruins of his ship. The dead ship's secret. The wreckage was worse than he remembered. The hull had been crushed from the impact, leaving jagged openings. The cockpit was buried under thick ice, and the power systems were dark. But there was one thing that wasn't dead, a faint blinking light deep within the wreckage. Daniel's stomach twisted. That was impossible. There shouldn't be any power left. He pulled his pistol free and moved forward cautiously. Esath followed close behind, her glowing eyes flickering with unease. Daniel reached the source of the light. His blood ran cold. It was a locator beacon still active. His distress call had never truly shut off. The Harvester ship hadn't left. It was still searching, and now it knew exactly where they were. Daniel turned sharply. "We have to go now." I barely had time to react before a distant roar cut through the storm, not the wind. Engines, something was coming. A desperate escape. The ship descended like a predator from the sky. Daniel grabbed Esath's wrist and pulled her into the wreckage. "Stay low." A bright light pierced the storm, scanning the ground below. The Harvester-class vessel loomed above them, its engines burning against the frozen air. Then movement, a metallic thunk, a landing. Daniel didn't wait to see who was coming. He yanked Est forward, moving deeper into the ruins of his ship. We need a way out of here. Eseth's glowing veins flickered rapidly. There is no out. They will find me. They always do. Daniel gritted his teeth. Not today. His mind raced. The locator beacon was broadcasting. If he could override it, make it send out a false signal, he could lead them away. But he needed time. He turned to Est. Can you still move? She nodded. Good. He shoved a cold metal shock baton into her hands. You see one of them hit first, ask questions later. Est blinked uncertain, but she gripped the weapon tightly. Daniel turned back to the beacon's interface, hands flying over the controls. If he could just... A sound behind him. He spun, heart slamming against his ribs. A figure stood in the opening of the wreckage, a human but not a rescuer. The man wore thick tactical armor, his visor reflecting the dim light. A hunter. His voice crackled through his helmet. Captain Rains, you have something we want. Daniel's grip tightened around his pistol. Eseth tensed beside him, her fingers twitching with barely controlled panic. The hunter stepped forward. Give us the girl, he said calmly, and you walk away. Daniel's breath slowed. The wind howled, and he made his final choice. Humanity fights back. The hunter had less than a second to react. Daniel shot first. The bullet slammed into the man's chest plate, knocking him back but not killing him. The armor was too strong, but that one moment was all they needed. Est moved like lightning. She lunged, her hands glowing blindingly bright, not blue but white-hot. She grabbed the hunter's wrist. A crackling hiss filled the air. The man screamed. His suit's thermal regulators failed instantly. Heat was ripped from his body in an instant. Frost crawled up his visor, freezing solid. Then he collapsed. Daniel turned to Est, his mind racing. She was panting, shaking. Her hunger had taken over, but she hadn't killed him. She had stopped. She had chosen. Daniel exhaled. You okay? Eseth wiped at her mouth as if ashamed. I had to. He nodded, grabbing her arm. Come on, there will be more. The ship overhead was circling back. They had minutes. Daniel finished hacking the locator beacon, rerouting the signal far from here. Then he grabbed Eseth's hand. Run. And together, they vanished into the storm. The long road ahead. They walked for hours, moving toward a signal Est had detected, an abandoned human outpost. A chance, a future. As they walked, Esalad's voice broke the silence. You shot your own kind. Daniel sighed. They weren't my kind. She looked at him, something unreadable in her glowing eyes. And then, for the first time, she smiled. Not hunger, not fear, just warmth. The storm raged on, but together they walked forward, and neither of them were cold anymore.